they used to have an item in Heat before I was there called Circle of Shame, where they would run a picture and they would put a circle around cellulite or sweat patch or a pimple, and they literally called it Circle of Shame. And then to try and make it soften it somewhat, by the time I arrived they'd changed the name to Hoop of Horror. So you get these people who go, right, let's apply the language of machinery, right, and cars to human beings and convince these men that they can be completely immune to the ebb and flow of irrational emotion, and they can actually train themselves to be like machines who exist only to perform at their very peak in every sense, whether that be career, money, relationships, or health and fitness. I think it sets really unrealistic goals. I think it sets a lot of men up for failure. I think it's profoundly flawed in its sort of assessment of what being a human is. But most of all, I find it really, really boring.
If you were to speak to someone in the same position as you, in the same kind of age and generation, who looks at things like speaking your truth and mindfulness and like, what the fuck does any of that mean? What would you say to that person in how they can help themselves if those really kind of juju things don't work for them? Hi Sam, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good. I'm happy to have you on the podcast here today. Just to let people know, I connected with you at the podcast show and you're doing a panel discussion about, how would you summarise it?
I think it was about the influence of podcasts in the so-called manosphere. And we were focusing in particular on the kind of podcasts that have become really popular that seem to encourage a high productivity sort of approach to masculinity. And we were discussing whether or not they were a positive or negative impact on young men in particular.
Yeah, I thought you'd be really great because obviously the audience is 70% male and sexonomic. And I always like to think it as, you know, there's this male audience and they're kind of shy, but they're a bit nosy and they kind of lurk in the background, but they're very friendly. So they'll be happy to have you here today.
Okay.
I had a look through your book, How to Stop Shitting Yourself. It's a very catchy title and yeah, it really grabs people's attention. But it's interesting that there's this dichotomy to do with, you know, masculinity and high performance and always having to have everything together as a man. And as a woman, obviously, I guess women get dealt their own dish of this, but it's so interesting how you began to layer all the different chapters. And I never thought about how many different prongs and approaches there are to that specific thing for men. So how did you even go by deciding all the different chapters? Because there's a few.
Well, I just kind of thought, I was thinking about my own life and the way in which in my life I've experienced my own challenges, my own mental health challenges, my own challenges in the past with addiction, and also overwork and burnout has been a feature of my life and my career. And I sort of thought, you know, I was aware of all of these podcasts that seem to encourage men to, you know, get up at 5 a.m, take an ice bath and, you know, devote their whole life to self-improvement. And, you know, an implication that if you're not doing this, then you're wasting your life. And, you know, I'm 50 years old. I'm a father of two. I've had quite a long career in the British media. And I thought to myself, well, I've got a certain amount of experience now of what that kind of approach to life does for you. And I understood that if you pile all that pressure onto yourself to be constantly productive and engaged almost solely in self-improvement, then it has a huge amount of negative impacts on your mental health and also on the people around you who you love and your ability to basically enjoy life and derive happiness from it. So I broke it down into sections that were very practical and applied to my life and most others. So rather than talking in an abstract way about this stuff, I was talking about all the things that had always been a source of anxiety for me throughout my life. And they were things like money, like work, like health and fitness, like relationships with other people. You know, this is the stuff that kind of affects most of us. And I tried to give a sense of how usually being balanced, i.e. not putting yourself under intense pressure to be the very best at everything you did, but having an approach that sort of involves rest and self-nurturing, self-care, and sort of trying to be positive about sometimes not giving it your all, trying to present a kind of more relaxed and laid back and balanced approach to life as, as an exciting and positive thing.
Yeah, because when I think about the word high performance specifically, a few years ago, to me, it would have just meant maybe an athlete is doing their sport and that's a high performance thing, right? You know, they're training for this thing that is very specific. And it wasn't really a fetishized word, was it? But now it's like fully taken its own different thing. And with that word high performance, where do you think it's now gone from being something which was simply to describe someone who is taking a pocket of their life from just working hard on it to completely, what it's become, whether it's on the High Performance podcast with Jake Humphreys, my personal favorite, Diary of a CEO, and I believe Spencer Matthews, he has a similar one. He's trying to flip into high performance. Where do you think that synapse between those two, like the actual meaning and this thing that, as I said, is fetishized, changed? Like, what was it?
Well, I think that most of these things, most stuff in the media, most podcasts or books or whatever, everyone's trying to flog you something, right? And, sort of chapter 1 of the marketing playbook dating back way beyond digital media is tap into an insecurity that people have and then try to offer them a solution to that, right? That they will find appealing. I think all those podcasts you mentioned are doing that. And you can see they're very specifically doing it. I mean, all the people who run these podcasts are almost always hawking rather spurious kind of products and services for money that they promise will, make someone leaner or fitter or smarter or richer, And high performance is just something that, you're right, it used to be applied to cars and machinery, right? And they started applying it to men because a lot of men, I think, are made to feel ashamed of their emotions and, basically their humanity. As humans, we all have emotions that are difficult to control and aren't rational. That's just part of the package. We're all like that. And I think, whereas women embrace that and develop a certain amount of emotional regulation and emotional maturity from a relatively young age, men try to almost kid themselves, or encouraged by society to kid themselves, that they're not influenced by irrational emotions. They are strictly rational, almost like machine men, which is almost like a denial of your own humanity, I think. So you get these people who go, right, let's apply the language of machinery, right, and cars to human beings and convince these men that they can be completely immune to the ebb and flow of irrational emotion, and they can actually train themselves to be like machines who exist only to perform at their very peak in every sense, whether that be career, money, relationships, or health and fitness. Yeah. I think it sets really unrealistic goals. I think it sets a lot of men up for failure. I think it's profoundly flawed in its sort of assessment of what being a human is. But most of all, I find it really, really boring and joyless. That's the main thing. You rarely hear or see these people smile or laugh. They've decided to convince young, vulnerable and gullible men that life is not about fun or joy. It's about getting up at 5 a.m, having an ice bath, and then filling in a spreadsheet. It's tedious, and I just think it's a shame. When I grew up, I'm sort of the 90s generation. Most of our heroes, whilst flawed, were all about having a laugh, celebrating freedom, being individual, and sort of grabbing life by the balls somewhat. We're seeing a little bit of a return this year to that ethos. We've seen all the Oasis mania take hold. I'm not saying that you can either be a hedonistic madman like Liam Gallagher in his heyday, or you can be a sort of slightly boring and austere high performance bro like Jake Humphreys. There is an in between. There is a balance. I don't personally subscribe to hedonistic lifestyle anymore, but what I do think is that we're here to have fun and enjoy life, you know, and we're here to nurture relationships with the people we love around us. And I just don't think that's compatible with this kind of insane turbo productivity ethos that a lot of these people are peddling.
Well, also, I don't subscribe to pretending like your shit doesn't stink, you know? Like, sorry to put it a little bit more rudely. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans, we all have errors, we all have faults, and these podcasts sometimes do portray like you have to be this robot, as you said, and never have an error or never have a bad day, which I just think makes the problem worse. And another thing that I don't really subscribe to as well is men aren't as emotional as women, which I think is such like a disservice to men, because again, I grew up in a family of boys, raised by a single father for a while, and then all my cousins are boys, so there's a lot of boys in our family, and I know that emotion exists in men, so I've had that privilege of seeing that. But in terms of when people say that, they go, oh, well, boys are a little bit less emotional and women are more emotional. No, men are just not allowed to express that emotion. Like, all of that is being bottled up inside of them. Women face their own problems in society, but they're allowed a slight more outlet of expressing that emotion. So what you just said there really reminded me of that. You know, men aren't given the permission to have an emotion, and if they do convey an emotion that isn't allowed, they're lambasted for it, which is just...
Yeah, even if they're not openly lambasted, because what you'll get now is like, you know, these high performance people will pay lip service to the idea of men being vulnerable or men, you know, having mental health challenges. And they will pay lip service to it because, you know, people are aware now that that's a fashionable thing to do and that society's moved on, and you have to acknowledge that that not all men are robotic, like you say. But the problem with that is that they don't understand that the sort of design for life that they're trying to sell is geared to discourage men from being vulnerable or embracing imperfection or understanding that sometimes doing nothing is the best thing to do in your life. You know, it's geared towards the very stuff that drives so many blokes to a state of like mental illness, because it's all about, you know, every moment of every day needs to be devoted to you in some way improving your life, improving your chances, improving your fitness and all the rest of it. It's really dull, but it really sets you up for failure. You know, if you think that every single day needs to be devoted to that sort of stuff, there's no way most people can sustain that. And so, you know, you end up so regularly disappointed with yourself. I know, because I've been that person, you know, at periods in my life. You know, I used to beat myself up the whole time. I've been self-employed most of my life. And, you know, as a self-employed person, you really do need to sort of like have a lot of self-discipline and a lot of drive to, you know, get up and earn your money every day. But sometimes you beat yourself up so badly when you haven't, you know, had a 10 out of 10 productive day. And it's really unhealthy. Just makes you feel rubbish about yourself, you know.
Especially in media, when you're working with like a lot of opinions that aren't necessarily right or wrong, right? You know?
Yeah.
You're just taking on like a lot of like emotional dredge sometimes of, you know, like from what I know, you were like an editor for some like magazines, and you did the lads mags. You do like gossip mags as well.
I edited Heat magazine, and the Naughties,
which is its whole own thing that I'd like to get into.
But
like, yeah, as well, like now working in media, and as well your mental health is like, I have to make sure that I'm saying the right thing because I don't want to get cancelled for here. And then, you know, if I make a light joke here, then, you know, are they going to take it well, or can I do that, or are they going to call me a snowflake? Like, there's so many things that you have to do to please other people. And I think actually the people have the most success with not having to pander necessarily to being this like perfect thing are often the people from the start who say, I don't do it. You know, right now, like specifically my generation, we all really love this pop star called Charlie XCX, you know, the whole Brat Summer thing. And that's because she's never subscribed to it. That's because she's like, I'm never doing this for anyone else. But anyway, segueing back onto the book, in terms of like when you were writing it, was it kind of a little bit confronting to go into your personal experiences, especially with all the feelings of anxiety that you had to kind of like work through or depluck, or was there like enough distance from that when you were writing it?
I first started writing about my mental health about 7 years ago. And when I first did it, I remember I was nervous. I did it in an article for The Guardian. And just wrote a small amount in a particular article about my own experiences of, having a drink problem and seeking therapy. And I felt quite nervous doing it, but I was encouraged to do it by the editor. And the response I got was overwhelmingly positive. And it actually made me feel really great because so many people got in touch and said, the persona that you have, that I had, which was slightly kind of laddie and self-confident, was very at odds with the sort of stuff I'd written about the way I felt inside, which was often being someone who's very anxious and insecure. And as a result, I think it had a big impact because people were surprised. And I suddenly realised that I could reach other blokes like me who had grown up in a blokey environment where they were discouraged from showing vulnerability. And I thought, I want to show people that you can be both things. You can be a bit of a Jack the Lad who likes going to the pub and watching the football and having banter with your mates. And yet can still be a softer side to you. You don't have to be one thing or the other. Do you know what I mean? We're all human beings. You don't have to sell out all your Jack the Lad credentials if you suddenly want to also get in touch with your feelings and get some help, And I thought, this is quite powerful. And the feedback I got was so good that then I started writing more about it in the papers. Then I started my own Substack and my own podcast. And the more I did it, the more positive feedback I received. And then I started getting people getting in touch and saying that, I'd encouraged them through sharing my own experiences to perhaps seek therapy or try to quit drinking or drugs. And I thought, and the more I did it, the more I just, the feedback I get just kept encouraging me to do it more and more. And I found it very cathartic, like a form of self-therapy as well. And so I wrote a book in 2023 called Sort Your Head Out, which was sort of like a memoir, my first sort of book about my own experience of mental health and addiction. And it was pretty successful. And the response I got was really positive, and I felt great about that. As a result of that, I kept getting more like work where various newspapers would ask me to write about subjects related to men and mental health. And I just got a huge amount of benefit personally from it, but also I got a lot of feedback saying that other people were being helped. So when I came to write this book, that was more me kind of trying to address ideas of masculinity and productivity with regards to my own career and my own life. But it was really just a continuation of the previous book, Sort Your Head Out. So by the time I came to write this, I'd become very used to writing about my own mental health, and I was very used to kind of sharing whatever. I found that the more honest and authentic I was, the better response I got. The only problem I've got is making sure that I don't overshare in that. I don't care what anyone knows about me really, but what I don't want to do is upset anyone else in my life. So obviously I've got a wife and 2 children, and when you're writing about your own life, then you're going to write about them. So I tend to run everything past my wife before I publish it, and she's very supportive. But if there's ever anything in there that she thinks kind of betrays confidence of her or the kids or anyone else in my family, then she will always be, she'll point that out to me. So that's my only problem. I've basically got sort of a kind of form of Tourette's around this stuff where I share almost anything because I don't feel uncomfortable about it anymore.
Yeah, I think this generation, they call it like, there's like a fine line between just being a very open person and then what they would call like a trauma dump, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think you've said in the book, or at the time you were writing it, you're 45, 46?
I'm 50 now. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, maybe I made reference like the book sort of takes in experiences from like my last sort of 10 years, especially like giving up drink and stuff like that. So I gave up drinking when I was 40, and that was really when I started to embrace all of this stuff and seek therapy and get to grips with my own feelings. I mean, before 40, I'd just been a very typical unreconstructed man who had no interest in that sort of stuff. And like a lot of people, I had to hit a kind of crisis point before I embraced this other side of myself.
That's the thing. If I look at what I'd call Gen X and baby boomers, there's this real kind of issue, real kind of thing to do with not speaking about emotions, and, you know, they're more likely to drink and kind of numb things. Like, if you look at young people now, they're not drinking as much as their parents did drink back in the day, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the correlation. It's interesting to see the correlation between not speaking about your emotions versus speaking about your emotions through how we've kind of let, whether it's children in this generation, feel like it's more socially acceptable. So if you were to speak to someone in the same position as you, in the same kind of age and generation, who looks at things like speaking your truth and mindfulness and like, what the fuck does any of that mean? What would you say to that person in how they can help themselves if those really kind of juju things don't work for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's really like one of the main points of both my books, is trying to remove that language from it. So both my books are candid, and all of my writing I try to deliver with humour. And
it's very honest as well.
Yeah, I try to be honest, and I try to have a sense of humour in everything that I convey. Because I know from my own experience, when I was younger, when I would never engage in any discussions about mental health or anything like that, I was completely put off by woo-woo language, psychobabble, and also that sense of being overly earnest and sort of self-pitying. I just thought, I just don't want any part of that. I find it nauseating. So what I'm trying to show is that it is very helpful to be open and honest about yourself, and you can do it without speaking in psychobabble, going barefoot, hugging a tree, basically becoming a weird hippie. You can still be one of the lads, right? And you can, in fact, still carry on doing all the things that you love to do, right? But at the same time, you can have the strength, the confidence, the maturity to accept your vulnerabilities and accept the fact that we all have ups and downs. And sometimes, you know, you get down in the dumps, and, you know, very often it's probably less productive to just try and numb those feelings out with alcohol and drugs, and more productive to sort of face up to those feelings and maybe talk about them with someone. But you don't have to become a weirdo and start wearing sandals. You know, you can still be one of the lads, but you can find people who've been through similar stuff to you, share your experiences and your feelings with them. And, you know, just having someone listen and show some sort of understanding will help you a great deal. But generations like mine, and certainly those above mine, older than me even, yeah, you're right. You know, we were sort of raised to think that anyone who talked about the way they felt was basically a moaner and a whinger. And that was the biggest fear of blokes. Is no one wants to be a moaner, no one wants to be a whinger, everyone wants to be strong, right? And therefore, it wasn't like we were immune to the same feelings and emotions that women have, but we just numbed them out. I know that's why I drank and took drugs from a very early age, from early adolescence until I was 40. The reason that I started, you know, been using alcohol and drugs from a very early age, from about 12 years old, I started, you know, drinking alcohol, then smoking weed, and then moving on to other stuff, because it was a good way of just numbing out difficult feelings that I didn't feel capable or able, or I felt like I didn't have the right to discuss with anyone, you know. And then when I finally did get sober, you know, I spoke to an addiction therapist, and she said to me, yeah, I mean, the point at which you start using drink to numb out your emotions is the point at which you stop emotionally maturing. She said, so if you started drinking when you were 12, 13, that's the emotional level you've reached, even though you're 40. So there's a lot of catching up to do. That made a huge amount of sense to me. I didn't have ways of dealing with sadness, anxiety, anger, disappointment, because when I felt any of those things, I would go down the pub and drink and then laugh it all off. But they'd still be inside of me. I was just finding a way of numbing it out or distracting myself from it, right? And I've been doing that from a very young age. So over the last 10 years, what I've had to do is go through the difficult work of confronting those emotions and working out sustainable, productive way of dealing with them for good, you know, rather than just going and getting pissed.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I look at addiction, whether it's through alcohol or drugs, There are people who can take a drink and it not be an addiction, right? And there are people who will take drugs and it's not an addiction for them. It's something more recreational. And there's like a difference that is very fine, but between someone who has to have it to elevate their time because they don't feel comfortable within their own selves, versus someone who's taking it for a recreational experience or some kind of, you know, I don't know why I did that, but some kind of like recreational experience.
Yeah.
However, I do feel it's the first one, like the numbing thing, that is so popular, especially in London. You look at so many unhappy people that live for the weekend and then they'll call their Coke dealer and they cannot go out unless they've got that little bag of Coke. And it's kind of, it's sad for me to look at them, but then again, I'm not them and I'm not going through their own experiences, and I have some kind of probably issue or addiction in some other part of my life. Like, I really don't think we get to choose our addictions. I just think, unfortunately, that's circumstantial. If you meet that thing at the right time in your life, it's going to be an issue. But people always think that it's something that can be helped, and it's the opposite. I mean, you can tell everyone, like, it's not something that can necessarily just be stopped like that. It's something that takes a lot of deep work and like understanding and going through it and processing it. And that's scary to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can stop drinking and taking drugs. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but you can do it. You know, people can cold turkey it. And, you know, to be honest, in most cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, you know, you might just cold turkey it for like a few days or a week, and then you stop getting the physical urges, you know, and then you might think, great, I'm sober now. But unless you start to address the things in your life or in your past that made you want to drink so heavily in the first place and find new ways of coping, then you're always going to be at a big risk of either going back to drink or finding some new outlet. So cross addiction is extremely common, you know, like people might quit drink, but then they become addicted to other things. Sometimes they're things that are seemingly quite positive. So exercise and work. Yeah, exactly. Exercise and work was my thing. For the first couple of years of sobriety, I really threw myself into work and exercise, and I burnt out really badly, you know. On a couple of occasions, in fact, before I realised that actually I hadn't fundamentally changed the things in my life that were making me stressed out, angry and frustrated. And when I did that, and a lot of that was just very simply introducing more balance, more rest and putting less pressure on myself, then, you know, I became a happier person. But like you say, you know, I don't like to sort of imply that everyone who drinks or even likes to do coke or something at the weekend has got a big problem. I was like, for many years, I was someone who was perfectly capable of going out at the weekend, having a few drinks, maybe on the odd weekend taking drugs, and then just not thinking about it again all week. And I honestly didn't think it impacted the quality of my life in any profound way. But the thing is, as my life became more stressful as I got older, I just started doing it more, you know. So if you've learned that, I suppose in my 20s, I didn't have a lot of stresses. You know, I didn't have responsibilities. And so I didn't have the need to sort of be drinking every day. But as I got towards 40, my life was very, very stressful. My career was extremely busy and stressful. And so was my home life. And I was under a lot of financial pressure. And I just started, like, I didn't really stop to think, what can I do to change the practical circumstances of my life to make things easier? I thought I didn't have any options. And I never stopped to think, how can I process the way this makes me feel in a more positive way? I just started drinking more and more and taking drugs more and more, you know, because it was like, that was my default setting. The more stressed I felt, the more I got off my face. That was me. But I think, you know, some people are just, you know, like I say, I don't think I was particularly emotionally mature. And a lot of people are, and they can just, like you say, have a drink as a lovely leisurely thing to do to make them feel relaxed or make them feel fun once or twice a week. And I kind of envy those people and I wish them the best.
But isn't it so funny that, you know, like Gen Z now are just so completely anti-pub culture, anti-drink, anti-clubbing. You know, there's like a nightclub shutting down every week in the UK. Like, that revolt is just so dramatic from, say, 10 or 20 years ago.
I don't know what the reason for that is. I sometimes wonder whether or not it's financial, though, because the truth is that when I was younger, you know, these things were relatively inexpensive ways to spend your time, have fun and meet people and connect with people. To be honest, like, I go to the pub now. I still go to the pub. I don't drink, but I go to the pub. I'll often go with my wife and kids, and I'll have like a Coke, or sometimes I have a, 0% beer or something like that. And by the time I've bought a couple of rounds, maybe some crisps or something, I'm like, I'm a 50-year-old bloke. I do all right. I've got money in the bank, but I'm like, this is crippling. My daughter's about to turn 18. She goes to the pub with her mates, and I have no idea. I go, how on earth are you going to the pub? When I went to the pub, we used to buy pints for £1.50 when I was a teenager, and go into a club wasn't like prohibitively expensive. So I don't know. Obviously, I'm not part of Gen Z, but I do sort of think, well, no wonder they're not going to do any of these things. That was like a cheap outlet for us. Now it's just impossible. Even as an adult with earning a good living, it's impossible to do those things. So if you're a teenager, it's just not on the agenda at all.
Yeah, and then like if you're not socializing, especially now, you're not really interacting, and the pandemic is a really good example of it. Like kids didn't go to school and didn't have an opportunity to socialize and mix and mingle. And also like now people aren't really going to the pub the way they used to go to. It kind of leaves such a vacuum and a gap for someone to come in, like, for example, especially with men like Andrew Tate, and exploit that gap and tell you actually why you're feeling sad is because of, you're a loser, you're not making money, you're not doing this and that. Well, no, it's actually nothing to really do with you. It's to do with the system around you that's making you feel like that. And this person's just trying to do a bit of snake oil to make you buy whatever he's trying to sell. But how do you even get, a teenager or a young adult to necessarily understand that, because they've just not got the world experience usually to understand that?
Well, I think your analysis is totally correct. I think that people feel isolated and don't have peers to bounce off as much perhaps, and therefore when you're lonely and isolated, you're vulnerable to snake oil salesmen with the courage of their convictions or a good line in bullshit like Andrew Tate. And I've got a teenage son, and obviously I'd be worried about him falling prey to those kind of scam artists. I think if I've raised him with the right values to understand right and wrong, and understand respect for other people, then, it doesn't matter how much he might be exposed to someone like Andrew Tate, he will understand that Andrew Tate is basically a wally. A lot of people said to me when I've written about Andrew Tate or spoken about him, a lot of lads of my generation have said, bloody hell, if someone had turned up in our pub when we were younger, coming out with the sort of rubbish he comes out with, he'd probably get knocked out, right? And I go, yeah, but the problem is that, we grew up in a culture where we were all a big bunch of mates all talking to each other and advising each other and influencing each other. And now, there's this weirdo, and he can get his claws into young kids who don't have that sort of social support network of peers who are instilling good values in them. So they're vulnerable to his line in bullshit. It's not in the pub where you're going to get the piss taken out of you for being such a weirdo, because he's a weirdo. He's like completely humorless, tedious person. You never see him smile. He is completely self-aggrandizing. He's like a comic character, but you can't perhaps see that if you're watching him in your bedroom, bored shitless. I mean, what I always say is, being a man, people try to tell you what is it to be a man, and he tries to tell you what to be a man. I go, there's no difference between being a man or a woman. There's no difference in how you approach life. You need to not take yourself too seriously, be kind to other people, have a bit of a sense of humour, try to be generous and open-hearted. That's it. There's no difference between being a man and a woman in terms of how you should approach your life. Kind of don't be a dickhead. That's the rule.
There's also just having a personality, and that's not exclusive to one gender. Like, we're kind of, robust in our understanding to understand that being a woman is not a monolithic experience, or being a man isn't a monolithic experience. Like, you can meet some women who are very, what you would describe as dominant, and they'll tell you what to do and where to go. And you might love or hate them for it. Or you might meet a man who is very sensitive with his emotions, and he explains things well, and he's able to articulate that. And I might find that really endearing. But someone, unfortunately, with, you know, a bit of a backwards understanding will see that as a weakness.
Yeah.
Just teaching kids that understanding of, you know, being a woman isn't a personality, it's just what you've got between your legs, or vice versa for a man.
Yeah, and it's I totally agree with that, but
with a slight, biological differences, obviously.
Yeah, but Andrew Tate and others will have you believe that there is some sort of personality template to be a so-called proper man, you know, and there's just no evidence of that culturally or biologically or even in evolutionary terms either.
It's interesting because, you know, we spoke to the lawyer who represents the victims on the case, Jack Beeston. And when I left that interview, I was left feeling, you know, these women who kind of do hang around him usually are from a background which is textbook trafficking, that's vulnerable, and they can sell in their own insecurity, sell in where that insecurity is like an ideal, and say, look, I can help you, and then obviously be horrible and nasty and traffic them and abuse them. And that's why he's going to the courts for that. Like, the court date's been set in the UK for him now, I believe. But like, it's worrying to me as a woman, on one hand, that men kind of look at the women he hangs around with, and then they get an understanding of, that's how women should be around me. If I do all the things Andrew Tate says, then why isn't this woman or this bitch doing what I say, you know? And like, I don't really worry about anyone above the ages of probably like 30 seriously thinking that way. But I do worry about people who are young and, you know, are coming of age, and that's their only experience of dealing with some kind of hardship to do with women. Because unfortunately, like, you will face rejection at some point in your life, whether it's, you know, financial, work, or with a woman. Like, it just happens. Not everyone's meant to be together. But if you're not taught to have the backbone to deal with these kinds of things gracefully, like, that's when it starts implicating women more dangerously, I think. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, is that, you know, I can only imagine that, you know, I was raised by a single mother, and, you know, I suppose that instills in you a particular amount of the, you know, the idea of, you know, respect and for women, but also just the idea that you don't really distinguish. There's no distinction between the way in which you would treat another man and another woman. There's not like, oh, this is how you treat women, this is how you treat men. You know, I was raised with the idea that you treat everyone with respect and kindness and generosity, you know. And so I just think that these, you know, that young people are vulnerable to Andrew Tate because they do not necessarily, they haven't been instilled with those values for whatever reason, you know. And like you say, you know, usually it's vulnerable, but just like the women he surrounds himself with will be vulnerable in that their, you know, their family circumstances might mean they haven't been raised with the amount of self-respect or the values that they need, or anyone who's looking out for them. I think it's similar to the sort of boys who might be sucked into his worldview. You know, there's nothing else in their life that is instilling them with the right values, because anyone who's instilled with the right human values would never be vulnerable, even if they watched hours or days of Andrew Tate content, because they'd just think, this is absurd. This is a bad, nasty, idiotic, boring man, you know.
Yeah, there's pockets of this wherever you go in life. You know, we're speaking about the dudes today, but also, like, in my age bracket, so I'm 26, there's this whole thing to do with clean girl aesthetic, like someone who wears like a matching yoga set and their bras and pants match, and they get everything done like on their list that they need to do in a day, and they're always put together, and their hair's always slicked back. And I guess, like, also it feeds into girl boss, which was a thing that happened a few years ago, like a hashtag girl boss. Like, you know, why can't you just be a boss? Why do you have to be like a girl boss? I don't understand. So, like, the theme of it, I guess what we're both trying to say is, like, it happens no matter what your gender, age. You're always being told that you need to be some kind of idealized version of what you should be. But the real lesson here is just to reject that and say you need to learn to be comfortable within yourself. And maybe that's the biggest favor we can do to children before they grow up and get kind of smudged into all of this stuff.
I think so, yeah, because, you know, this is all about marketing, selling and money. You know, ultimately anything, you know, everyone advertising for time immemorial has been about make people feel insecure about the way that they look or the way that they're living their life. Present to them an ideal that they should aspire to, sell it to them. You know, that's all it is. It's all one big sort of, you know, and it's fine. It's fine to aspire to be a better person, but you know, you have to make sure who is it? How do I define a better person? Do I have my own thoughts on who I would like to be and how I can improve my life, or am I just being spoon-fed an idea by someone who's on the make? Do you know what I mean? Because we've all got different versions of ourselves that we'd like to be. Just make sure that you're aspiring to the right thing and not something that's been spoon-fed to you by an influencer or an advertiser or a hashtag or something like that. You know, like you might, your aspiration might be to live a peaceful life. Do you know what I mean? Of relaxation and pleasure. You know, no one's gonna, or a simple minimalist life. Not many people are going to try and flog you that, because there's not much money in it, is there, for you know, corporations or brands or influencers.
My friend said something to me the other day, and she sometimes gets a bit nervous when people are quite stoic and they're speaking to her because she's nervous that they don't like her. And she's just said to me the other day, like, you know what, if someone doesn't like me, I don't trust them. I was like, that's really good advice.
Yeah.
In terms of what you were saying, in terms of like the insecurity feeding and dripping in, I guess you do have behind the scenes knowledge of that when it comes to magazines and selling, especially with Closer magazine. Because I remember growing up and seeing all the magazines, you know, on the shelf, and some were worse than others, but especially now we're having a renaissance and looking back and thinking, were we actually doing the right thing and speaking about the right thing? Because we'd always have like women's weight on there, like we'd have a picture of Britney Spears. I remember there was one specific picture of Britney Spears on a beach. She doesn't know paps are there, and then it goes, Britney Spears, absolute whale, 9 stone. And then, like, as a young girl, you would read that and go, oh God, like, I better not get to 9 stone. Like, God, I can't, you know, like, now we're having a conversation about whether that was the right thing back then. But, I mean, what can you say from the time back then when you were involved in the mags back then?
Okay.
Perfect.
So I joined Heat magazine in like 2009, and it had already been successful for about 7 years. It'd been a big hit, and I think the idea behind it when they launched it was almost a more positive thing about the way it would make women feel about themselves, because before that, female celebrities had been presented by glossy magazines as these sort of, you know, ideals, you know, models of perfection. And, you know, I'd seen that when I'd worked in men's mags. Everyone was photoshopped. No one had cellulite. Everyone had flawless skin. And it was all faked, right? So what Heat tried to do was show the reality, to almost empower women to think, you know what? There's no such thing as perfect. There's no such thing as ideal. These celebrities who you see in their pop videos on MTV do not actually look that way. We're going to show you how they actually look, and we're also going to show you that their lives aren't perfect either. You think they've got a celebrity boyfriend and a mansion in Hollywood, but you know what? They suffer from insecurity, heartbreak, sadness, failure, and all the other things that normal people like us feel. Isn't that wonderful? And I think they started with a positive mindset in doing that. They said, let's show that, you know, because women felt insecure because they thought there was a perfect life that they could be and should be living. And I think that was quite a nice idea. But it kind of steered into, they got too preoccupied with it, because readers responded in that era with huge enthusiasm to any negative details about celebrities' lives. It was almost like an addiction. Now. And if you ran a story about a particular celebrity, you know, having difficulties in her love life, or putting on weight, or losing their money, right? The more those stories, those magazines would sell in the thousands, and that would generate millions of pounds of revenue, right? And the thing about magazines is, once you discover a formula for what your readers want to buy, and that will shift large numbers of magazines, you keep doing it again and again and again. And I think Heat and the other celebrity magazines in the noughties, once they discovered that the more negative imagery and negative stories that they fed to their readers, the more copies they could sell, they would just double down. So in the end, you end up with stories that were pretty brutal, like the one you describe of Britney Spears, you know, and the paparazzi's got out of control in pursuing these celebrities to try and get candid pictures of their life, basically in crisis. And in the end, it started to look a bit like bullying, right? So I joined the magazine with no previous experience of celebrity journalism. I'd come more from a kind of pop cultural background, and they made me editor of the magazine with a specific brief to soften it, because they were aware that it had gone too far, and that probably advertisers were starting to have second, because, you know, you rely a lot on the revenue you make from advertisers, and they noticed that advertisers were being a little bit uncomfortable with stuff about body image. Or they used to have an item in Heat before I was there called Circle of Shame, where they would run a picture and they would put a circle around cellulite or a sweat patch or a pimple, and they literally called it Circle of Shame. And then, to try and make it, soften it somewhat, by the time I arrived, they'd changed the name to Hoop of Horror, right? Because they thought, oh, we can't say it's shameful, but we can say it's horrifying, right? So I came in, and my brief was to change that. And so I just did some simple things, like from the beginning, I sort of took out references to cellulite, I took out the Circle of Shame, and I took out any covers about body image. Right. Unless there was a celebrity who was openly wanting to deliver a positive news story about something to do with their health or fitness, we did get behind that. So I can remember celebrities saying, you know, I've lost this amount of weight and I've done it in a really great way through exercise and balanced diet, whatever. I want to do an interview about it and a photo shoot. You go, yeah, okay. People would find that inspirational.
The celebrities, like some of the like reality stars, would purposely pile on weight, so then they can get this deal, and then they can sell like weight loss like DVDs and stuff. So then like also that happens as well.
Oh yeah, 100%. You know, and sometimes the magazine be complicit in that. I mean, you know, I know of people who would sit down with a celebrity and their agent and say, okay, here's the deal. Spend the next 3 months eating a lot of cake, pile it on, we'll do a photo shoot with you, and then we will pay for you to go to effectively what they used to call a fat camp, right? So you go to a very luxurious private kind of health and fitness farm, and with the help of a nutritionist and a personal trainer, lose all the weight and do a follow-up photo shoot. These are things that went on back then, you know, and with the and it was sometimes celebrities approaching you with that idea. So yeah, it was all being monetized, you know, and and it, you know, there's big consequences for that, you know, for a generation of women who grew up with it, younger readers in particular, I would say. I think that, you know, he had a lot of sort of women in their 30s who read it too, who read it because they thought it was funny and ironic and silly and irreverent, and that was a lot of our readership. But I was also aware we had a lot of younger readers who wouldn't tap into the irony of anything and would just, you know, become preoccupied with these stories about fluctuating weight and whatnot, you know. And also just a sentiment of, I would say, gloating over the misfortune of other human beings. If you take the celebrity element out of it, right, there was a notion these people are rich, these people are famous, these people rely on us, the normal members of the public, for their careers, and therefore they're fair game. They're fair game. We can say what we like about them. And what that meant was that they were effectively dehumanized. We could, and so the tone of the noughties generally, not just in magazines, but you can look back at TV shows of the time as well. There was a sort of or even just in social circles at that time, there was it was sort of a brutal atmosphere to that decade, I think, that I observed, where being mean about other people was okay. And I'm delighted to say that we've come a long way since then. And you will not see, because it has an effect on real life. If in popular culture, famous people are being absolutely battered day in, day out and mocked for their own misfortune or their own imperfections, that does trickle down into the way in which ordinary people communicate with one another, in my opinion, right? And now I think that we have a more caring and compassionate sort of way of speaking to one another, generally speaking,
Yeah, but now you've got like X and Instagram, and it's funny because a lot of people will get angry at magazines from the past doing that kind of thing, but now because we have social media and that's like where people get their news from, now everyone feels free to leave a comment like, ooh, she looks like she's lost weight, or she's gained weight, or he looks a bit weird, like he looks like he's going old. Like, it's like what's the Batman saying? Like, you become the villain eventually,
Yeah.
Like, I would never even understand why anyone would leave a comment about someone's body or their physical appearance. Like, the only way I would really like do that myself is if someone attacked me. I'd probably be a bit petty and attack them back, right? But there's just like an online circus of people giving opinions now, thinking that it's relevant all the time. But
that's true. That is true. But generally speaking, if you look through comments, now we have the ability to make these comments, and there will be, and the ones you notice the most will be the mean ones. But the positive ones, which are usually more bland and uninteresting, will always outweigh the more attention-grabbing negative ones, I think. And I think that in broader culture, people are much more willing to be understanding and forgiving. That's just my observation. I know that it's said now, social media has made us all so mean and so argumentative, and I can see that. But my own experience of those bygone years were that people would say awful things very publicly about other people, and it was all considered fair enough and funny. Whereas now, of course, there's always going to be arseholes who write mean things about other people. But I feel that rather than laugh at it or celebrate it, we will, most people will know, God, what an arsehole, what a dick move, what a nasty thing to say, I remember in the 90s, it's like, you could tune into mainstream television programs like panel shows and stuff, and everyone would just be mean the whole time. That was the currency, that was the humour. Who could be the most mean? If you looked in newspapers or magazines or listened to the radio or watched comedy, there was a vibe of it's all ironic anyway. Let's just all bully each other. Do you know what I mean? And it was kind of horrible. And I used to do a lot of TV in that era as well. And the amount of times you'd end up being on a TV show or a radio show, and you just end up engaging in just one long kind of really mean exercise in bullying. And that was the tone. And I'm not sure whether public discourse is as mean-spirited as it was in the noughties. I don't think it is. I think that, our increased awareness of mental health has made us, generally speaking, more compassionate. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of people being dickheads online, but that's never going to be eradicated fully. Well, because there are a lot of insecure people out there,
Yeah, definitely. And I guess you come from like the more traditional journalist background, you're writing articles and, you're editor of magazine. It's interesting to see the migration of media now. Like The Devil's Wear Prada #2 is being made right now, and it's to do with like the demise of people buying magazines and how they expand their online presence, right? And it's interesting now because we have podcasts, we have a lot of news doing more panel-based discussions and debates. And like, on one hand, like, I'm happy because it gives the chance for the everyday person maybe to get on a panel or get on a podcast and have a discussion. You know, it's more democratizing. But for example, like, an example of this is like Piers Morgan. He comes from a traditional journalist background, right? And then he has his Piers Morgan show where he does panels now. And like at the beginning, or you can almost see it when he was under like the Murdoch constraints, he would have to have a somewhat balanced panel, not like a perfectly balanced one, but often someone on the left, someone on the right, and they'll fight in the middle or whatever. But now I just feel like he gets on like absolute like trash cans now. Like, it's not even about let's extract something that's knowledgeable and something where we're going to have an understanding of one another. Let's make the circus, let's make them fight, and let's get as many views as possible. So yeah, your take on like the migration from that, the traditional journalism thing, now into this whole opinion-based news cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there is a crisis, a financial crisis in traditional media. You know, no one pays for content, or very few people do, and advertising is less lucrative than it once was as well. So online, there's a race to the bottom, you know, for people to kind of, you know, opinion's cheap, journalism's expensive, reporting is very expensive in terms of money and just time and resources, right? So now, not just online content, but, you know, newspapers, television news, they fill so much more time with opinion because opinion is so cheap. Everyone's got one, and you can wheel any old person, right, talking head, gobshite, into your studio, right, or interview them or get them to write 500 words with their opinion. It's easy. You don't need to go out and do any reporting or spend time getting to grips with a subject. You can just say off the top of your head anything. And the thing is, reasonable opinions that are well balanced and insightful are not going to be attractive online or on social media. They don't get the sufficient amount of clicks. So opinion is cheap, and the sort of opinion people want is extreme opinion that provokes big reaction and a lot of clicks, and clicks are going to make you more likely to earn the ad revenue you require in order to continue to put food on your table. That's the simple reality of what has become of the media. And I don't know what the solution to that is, other than there are some media outlets that will not engage in trying to get the most clicks. They will try and get the highest quality audience. So they will try and apply intelligence and rigor to their journalism in the hope that, although they will never have the biggest audience, they will have an audience that they can say to advertisers is a more distinguished, educated, and perhaps more valuable audience, right? So you do get some journalistic outlets that are like that, although they're increasingly few and far between. The other thing is, you know, I would say if people are frustrated by this, then they should start paying for their news and their journalism. You know, I subscribe to various different things, whether that to be various Substacks where I think that the writer is intelligent and compelling and is working hard and deserves something in return, or bigger news organisations that I think are still trying to do original journalism in a credible way. I pay for it. You know, I bought newspapers from a very young age. That's why I wanted to be a journalist, because I loved reading newspapers and magazines. And I spent, in days when I still got pocket money, I would spend it on print media, you know. And I still do that now. And to be honest, I've got loads of subscriptions to newspapers, some of which are newspapers that I don't even agree with the politics of, if I'm honest, right? Because whether or not I agree with their politics is not the point. They're investing in journalism, original journalism, and I don't want to just give my money to people who I agree with so they will mirror back to me the prejudices I already have. I think any organisation that is trying to do original journalism and not just fill our heads up with a load of algorithm pleasing kind of mad vitriol, you need to back that shit.
Diet as well.
You do, yeah. I tried to look at, you know, I've got subscriptions to, you know, the Guardian and iNews, but also to the Times and the Telegraph, you know, and I'll look at all of those front pages every day to get a mix, and I'll look at the BBC Two, and then I'll look on, the various Substacks that I subscribe to as well for opinion, but opinion that I think is slightly more measured and intelligent and informed. And I try to scan all of this stuff and get a good mix, but I pay for it, and it's not a lot of money, because you're talking about £5 a month here, £5 a month there. You're not talking about spending hundreds of pounds a month. And people need to understand that they're all complicit. If it's frustrating that you've got the likes of Piers Morgan just filling up his online show with a load of gobshites who he knows will just, basically flogging conflict. Right, that's what it is. It's like
the trans debate for the 160th time as well.
Yeah, exactly. If that is frustrating to you, I would say pay for news media so there is an alternative. Because if not, all we're going to end up with is just that on every single outlet. And, there are certain newspapers that are going that way as well. They can't afford to employ proper journalists. Or even if they do, they can't afford to fund those journalists doing proper stories. And so you'll see some newspapers that every day really now are just like, let's get another opinion piece, Yeah.
I mean, I think what's more worrying is what I do. I'll go through my Google feed and I'll see, something's happened, and GB News is saying this about Trump, but then the Telegraph is saying this, and I'll just literally I'll literally just go onto ChatGPT and I'll say in the barest way what's happened. And then I'll kind of work through that way to understand what's happened, and then I'll look at the sources to understand. But again, someone who's younger and someone who is probably a teenager or just turning as a teenager or a child, they're not going to have the world understanding to look at different sources and analyse and then come to their own conclusion.
Yeah, and I mean, ChatGPT, what sources is that drawing upon? How confident are you in what ChatGPT feeds back to you?
I often they will cite the link to the sources, and it will be stuff like the Telegraph, the Times, or it'll be something like the Sun, or just general British publications. But you know what, I'm dyslexic, so to me reading an article is very overwhelming, like a big wall of text. I'm like, gosh. So what I'll do often is I'll put the article on speaker so I can listen to it, and then it goes in a lot better. Good, yeah. So I just use it as that kind of tool, but I wouldn't say I'm probably the person to judge the general consensus of how people consume their news. I'm just probably a little bit more individual of I can't, it's not going to work for me wading through a very long article. I can't do it. It's interesting to speak about though, how different people consume news and media.
Yeah, it is. And to be honest, sometimes I just take a break completely from it. I do from time to time just remove myself from it. I think it's another high performance thing in some ways. People go, you have to stay abreast of exactly what's going on. And you have to have an opinion. There's a pressure to have an opinion, a well-informed opinion, an opinion that is original and different from other people's, and be across a lot of different things. Sometimes it's all right to just say, no, I'm not interested. I've got my own life and my own, I've got my own issues, and I need to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. And I don't need to be constantly engaged in this stuff if it's not serving me well.
I'm bombarded, I'm reading a book at the moment to do with Tina Brown when she was editing Vanity Fair. And she made a point of, people would think a lot more about the layout and how that's curated and how that's going to speak to the reader who's reading the magazine. But now, it's literally just what do you see on Google? What do you see online? For most people, and there's not really a set. As you said, journalism is expensive, and a lot of people can't afford it.
No, I mean, I would encourage people to read my books, which are just all they aspire to do is not really give a huge amount of advice, more to sort of share my own experiences of how I've kind of, tried to get on top of my mental health, how I tried to conquer some of my bad habits and my addictions. And it's all from a perspective of a guy who was sort of raised in a, sort of working class blokey environment, who was raised to be very hostile and sort of skeptical about any kind of woo-woo mental health stuff. And I've tried to sort of, encourage people to be a bit more curious about, taking care of themselves, and understand that you don't have to be some sort of weirdo or hippie or start doing yoga to sort of just take a bit more interest in your own well-being, because we all go through shit times. No matter who you are, you could be the toughest bloke in the world, you're going to go through shit times, and there are ways that you can treat yourself gently and take care of yourself to sort of soften those shit times. And so I've just tried to tell my own story in a very honest way in order to show people that it is possible. And I also write a Substack, which you can see at samdelaney.substack.com. It's called The Reset, and both the books were kind of based off of the success of that Substack. There are a ton of articles on there, and there's also over like 130 interviews with mainly blokes. Some of them very famous, some of them you might not have heard of, but all of whom have had interesting challenges in their life, talking very frankly and honestly, and in no psychobabble, and often with humour and with complete honesty and down to earth sort of vibes about stuff like mental health, addiction, and all the rest of it.
Well, if that's not that well explained for you, I don't know what can be. Go and have a look at Don't Stop Shitting Yourself. How to stop shitting yourself. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you, Sam, so much for coming on today. I know that this podcast is going to help like a few of the listeners listening to this, so just thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure, Heidi. Thank you for having me.
If you found this episode interesting or enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button down here. It helps me out more than you know. I'm an independent production. Or check out one of our past episodes here. There's one here, there's one here. That's what I'm imagining.